Hey, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be jumping inside Premiere Pro and taking a look at using scopes to grade your footage perfectly every single time, so that you have confidence that it looks good on every single monitor. All right, let's jump into it. So I have Premiere Pro open right here, and I have some footage of the last video I just shot. So we have a YouTube studio setup of me in front of a camera here, and the whole thing has been shot on the Canon R5 in C-Log3. So the entire thing is pretty ungraded, but it's properly exposed and it's all white balanced properly. I have some more footage here just as a bit of a sample of what happens when your white balance is all wrong and when you have an underexposed scene. So we'll take a look at that later as well. But let's jump into it. Whoa, that's a good shot right there. So the first thing to do is to find a nice looking frame that your subject is looking at the camera, and then come over here to window and come down to telemetry scopes. So make sure that's ticked, and if that's ticked, you should get your scopes up here. Another way of doing it is by coming down here to workspaces and clicking on the coloring option, and that will open up your scopes. Now, if you haven't used scopes before, don't be intimidated. I know they look a little bit complex, but I promise you it's super simple and it makes your life so much easier when it comes to color grading your footage. So let's open up the scopes and I'll run you through it. Over here we have 3 different types of scopes, and if we right click, we've actually got a 4th option here that we can click on, and we can see those 4 different types of scopes. Now you might be wondering, what the hell are scopes? Scopes essentially are a visual representation of the colors, the contrast, and the saturation within the image itself. So we have our image over here on the right hand side, and this image is broken down into pixels. We've got a certain number of pixels this way and this way, with different colors through each pixel. And we can see that on these scopes. So for example, if we just take a look at this scope down here, so we'll turn off the parade, we'll turn off this one, and we'll turn off the histogram. Okay, so we have here our waveform, and the waveform shows from left to right of the screen the different brightness essentially of our image. So if we have a look at our scene, we've got here the most exposed, or the brightest part of our image is absolutely this light, which is actually blown out. And the darkest spot, I would say, is probably my shirt in the middle here. And we can see that the image that's overexposed is actually blowing out on the highlights at the top here, with 100 representing blown out or overexposed areas of our shot. Now down here we have 0, which is our blacks being crushed as well. So we have here all of our shadows of I'm guessing my shirt here, my jumper, coming down here. And then on the right hand side, you'll see that this sits in the midtones here, which is this area over here, which has the detail. It's not overexposed and it's not underexposed. So you might be thinking, how does this help? Well, when we're looking at contrast with our image, we can very quickly see, okay, our blacks aren't actually touching black. So we're not using the most of the contrast within our image. So very quickly, very easily, we can add a bit of contrast to our image, and we can bring those blacks right down to just touching the bottom, but not crushing them. Maybe bringing those whites back just a little bit, just so they're just off the top. And now the contrast of our image is perfectly set. So what about the other scopes that we have? Over here we have Parade. Now Parade's my favorite and go-to scope because it shows us what the waveform showed, but it breaks it down into RGB. That's red, green, and blue. So what we can see here is the same image, but we're seeing red, green, blue. So for example, if I add a heap of green to this image, you'll see that the green on the scopes goes up proportionally to how much green is added to the image. This can make it really easy to white balance an image, because all white balance is within our image is just too much white within the whites. So when we're doing white balance for our shot, all we need to do is select an area on our screen that is white. So we can do that by drawing a box, for example, around an area that we know is white. There we go. And then jumping back to those scopes, and you'll see if it's in fact white, the RGB should be pretty much even. If, for example, blue is too high on an area that we know is white, then the entire image, when we delete that mask, is going to be too blue. Using this method makes it really easy to white balance your shot, because you just find an area in your shot that is white, you make a mask around it, and then you go to your scopes and you just make sure that all those 3 levels are set equally. So let's recap a little bit. We know that we've added the right amount of contrast to our shot because our blacks are touching the bottom and our whites are just touching the top. We know that we've white balanced because if we come to effects and select an area on the screen that we know is white, and then we come over to our scopes, those 3 levels are even. It's a little bit off here, so I might just tweak that just a smidgen, bring up those greens, bring up those blues just a little bit. There we go. And then what we can do is delete that. So now we know our white balance is set, our contrast is set. What about our saturation? So this is where we can come over here and we can turn on the vector form. And what vector form is going to show us is it's going to show us the level of saturation within the image as well. So if we come over to creative and add some saturation into the image, you can see how it expands that line outwards. Now, this is really up to you and your personal preference. There's no right or wrong when it comes to how much saturation you should add to your image. But it's important to notice that as you add saturation to your image, the reds are also being increased in the image and the blues should come down. There we go. So you can see that the blues come down, the reds increase a little bit. Now, I would probably set the image around about there, personally. And that looks right to me. Okay, so now that we know that our contrast is set properly, our white balance is set properly, our saturation is at the level that we're happy with, we might look at those skin tones and say, whilst the contrast is right, the skin tones look a little bit warm. And then we can come over to our color wheels and just bring down that mid-tone just a little bit there, because that's going to affect that middle portion of our image. It's not going to actually affect the top and the bottom area. So we can bring that right down to where we're comfortable with and just eyeball that. There we go. Now some people have specific measurements that they like their skin tones to sit at. And again, if you wanted to do that and get the perfect skin tones, you could grab a mask, you could draw it around just the skin tone area. There we go. And then you can have a look at that and say, okay, cool. Those skin tones, which we don't want them to be white, right? They are sitting at, red is at 80, green is at 70, and blue is at 60. Now you might decide that's where I want my skin tones to sit, and that's the right lumetry, and that's the light, and that's the right brightness for my skin tones. If we bring that right down, you'll see that those numbers will drop over here. I'm happy with them sitting right where they were, around about there. But another really cool feature that you can use with scopes is to know whether or not your skin tones are actually the right level of yellow or red, because we want to make sure that the skin tones are coming up perfectly. See, unlike white balance where we want to make sure that the red, green and blue are all exactly equal, we don't want to do that with our skin tones. And oftentimes people are looking at the skin tones. It doesn't really matter so much if the rest of the image is a little bit off with the white balance, but if the skin tones are off, it makes the person look sickly, it makes them look a bit pale, it just throws off the entire image. So many times you can get away with a really cool or different looking, matrix looking color grade, but the skin tones, they need to be right. In fact, the scopes actually has a feature built into it to deal with this, and that's called the bloodline. So if you have a look on the right hand side here, I'll make that big by getting rid of our parade. We've got here this line, and this line is universal across all different types of skin tones. So it doesn't matter if you're color grading somebody that's got darker skin or lighter skin, it really doesn't matter at all. As long as your skin tones, when you've grabbed a mask and drawn over that area of skin, is falling on that line, your skin tones are going to come out looking perfect every single time. So if we, for example, add too much green to this image, you'll see that that actually diverts away from that line. And when we turn off that mask, the skin looks horrible there. The rest of the image also looks horrible, but the skin also looks pretty bad. So if we turn that mask back on again, jump back over here, and we move our midtones around until we're sitting exactly on that line. Now, obviously, if we push a lot of saturation, it's going to pull the image closer out, further out, rather than staying in towards the middle. So we can play with that saturation here as well. So the goal is to get your line here onto that blurred line. And if that line is a little bit off, it's important that we move it across just a little bit to try to get it exactly on that line. And that is going to create a perfect skin tone every single time. It doesn't matter what type of monitor you have and what it looks like on your monitor, because if you know that the skin tone is on that bloodline, it's going to look great on every single monitor. So let's delete that mask and have a look at our final image. Okay, so to recap, we've come over to scopes, we've opened our parade, and we've had a look at where the whites are sitting at the top and where the blacks are sitting at the bottom. And that's giving us the overall contrast of the image. Then we've went ahead and we've selected something that's white on the screen. And that tells us exactly what the white balance is and making sure that our image is perfectly white balanced. Then what we've done is we've come across and had a look at our vector scope to make sure that we're adding the right level of saturation with our image. And of course, that is pretty subjective. And then finally, we've selected an individual element of the skin, made sure that the exposure isn't too high in those midtones, and we've also made sure that our skin tones are sitting on that bloodline, and that's given us the perfect looking color graded image. Scopes are an incredibly useful tool because you don't have to have expensive, high quality monitors that are color accurate and rely on your eyes. You're able to actually just look at the scopes and see in graphical detail exactly where the image is sitting. And you know that it's going to be color graded equally across all different monitors. It's what professionals use. It's also something that isn't actually talked about a lot within the world of video making. It's something that's kind of put on the sidelines and left alone because it looks very technical, but I promise it makes things so much easier. Give it a go. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of this video and these types of tutorial videos. I'm thinking about doing more and more of these types of videos, so keen to hear your feedback. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.